Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. And I'm excited to be here and to share some of the ideas from my book 11. And I think probably everybody is pretty aware of the tremendous number of social and ecological problems that we're facing as on a planetary scale and locally. I think these are really challenging this idea that Baha'u'llah presented, that we should all be focused on creating an ever-advancing civilization. And with 11 billion people projected by the end of this century, we're actually going to be going into some very challenging times. So this is I guess the main theme of my book, and I'm just trying to make my little slideshow move. Okay, it's moving. So I think in a sense, my book can be kind of boiled down to a couple of propositions. And the first proposition is this idea that uniting humanity will heal the planet. And behind that is this idea that the state of the ecosphere is a reflection of the human condition. So in a sense, this massive environmental problem we're having internationally is really a social issue, in a sense, more than an environmental issue. So the second proposition is kind of the opposite, that the task of healing the planet is something which we can use to unite humanity. So those are sort of the two propositions of the book in a nutshell. Now, interestingly, scientists have some positive views about the future, some very negative, but this famous biologist, Edward Wilson, talks about human beings having enough goodwill intelligence to turn Earth into a paradise, and by the end of this present century. So he has this positive view of the future, even though he's one of the foremost critics of our environmental status today. And he talks about this being a time unprecedented in human history, and where it's possible, he sees it as we're in the part of, sort of on the, have a potential at least to address with the greatest confidence, the greatest goal of all time, the unity of the human race. So very interesting, coming from a scientific perspective, because of course this is the goal of the Baha'i faith as well. So Wilson talks about some of the things that are blocking this potential. He talks about the Paleolithic curse. So societies have been adapted around this idea of a struggle for existence, which is also something that Baha'u'llah talks about in his writings. Baha'u'llah talks about the struggle for existence being the fountainhead of calamities. And you know, this struggle for existence, in a sense, is how human beings have adapted and survived and progressed. But according to Wilson, this our dysfunction today is a condition of the youthful state of global civilization, where we're kind of stuck in this modality of competition and struggle for existence. However, we are growing up, and the gradual emergence of global civilization can be seen. People are starting to kind of have a consciousness of things like peace, the importance of peace, the elimination of war and arms and so on. And perhaps people are aware of Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he talks about how violence has declined, even though it appears that it's increased dramatically. It seems that our focus on media and so on, our ability to publicize many of the terrible events that happen, give us the impression that we're more and more violent. But actually, if you look at the statistics and you go back to even to forensic anthropology and how many people used to die by violence in the past compared to today, we're actually much, much more peaceful today. Especially the first 10 years of this century have been among the most peaceful in the history of the world. So these are signs of kind of a maturing of the human race. We have things like the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a real signal achievement for humanity, where we actually recognize that all human beings have unalienable rights. So, according to my propositions, if humanity unites, the planet should be healed. And in fact, I think we are seeing some of this happening. This unification process is happening at a certain level of maturity we're achieving. And simultaneously with that, we are seeing this emergence of ecological awareness. So we are seeing progress on this front as well, even though much of the time it's not that evident. So there's, for example, the right to a healthy environment is explicitly recognized in 100 national constitutions. 181 out of 193 nations agree it's a human right. Interestingly, I think, Canada doesn't see that, and the United States neither, but many countries do. And we have these huge meetings of humanity, of leaders and leaders of thought, like the Earth Summit, the Millennium Summit, and the climate summits that have happened, where people have at least put together really, I think, viable plans for solving some of our problems, even though they often are not carried out. But at least the ideas are in place. So it seems like there are a number of positives, but there are these two processes in place that we're still dealing with, the processes of integration and disintegration. So we're seeing the world coming together socially on some levels, and yet there's also the disintegration of the old world order at the same time. Same with the environment. We're seeing a lot of progress in many areas, but a lot of real destruction in other areas. So what drives these processes? What drives integration? What's driving disintegration? Well, we go back to this idea of, Abdu'l-Baha talked about the reality of man as his thought. So our thoughts, our ideas, our values, and so on are really significant in this study. And this great Ukrainian scientist, Vladimir Vernadsky, talked really about the same thing from the scientific point of view, about reality being a product of focused human attention. So humanity has been a very successful species, and with our collective focused attention, we're really altering the whole ecosphere. And I think it's really, ironically, I guess it's our ability to cooperate as a species which has allowed us to conquer the planet, become kind of a dominant species on the planet for good or for ill. So we've had this, we've talked about the struggle for existence. There's been this incredible success by the human race, in one way of looking at it. And just this graphic gives you an example of how this has happened. So this is Earth's land mammals by weight. You can see that wild animals are now just a tiny fraction of all the land mammals in the world. So most of the mammals are now us. We're the dark gray squares, and our livestock and pets. And wild animals, wild mammals are a very small portion of them. So it really shows you kind of the huge impacts that human beings have had in sort of taking over the ecological space in the world, the ecosphere. And so now geologists are talking about, they talk about the ages of the world, and now we're saying we're moving into the Anthropocene era, where human beings are the most significant transformative force on the planet. So we're doing now what erosion, earthquakes, tidal waves, and those sort of things did in the past. Now human beings have that kind of impact. So our thoughts shape the world quite literally. And the outer world, our environment, really reflects our inner world, the world of I guess, our inner state, our state of our thoughts, our values, and so on, and also our human relationships. And the ecologist Stan Rowe talked about this idea of the landscapes of our making match and reflect society's cultural inscapes. And again, Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, talked about this idea coming from a spiritual perspective, but how our inner life actually molds the environment, and the other way around, the environment molds our inner life. So even in the in science and physics and so on, this kind of concept of how our consciousness actually becomes engaged in this sort of physical process. Don't ask me to explain it, but this statement from John Wheeler, one of the great physicists, no phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. So actually, reality is in a sense created by the observers of that reality. So I just want to give a practical example of how this happens. And this is a picture, an aerial photograph of part of Saskatchewan where I live. This is the Cypress Hills. And this is an area that's never really been developed for agriculture, I guess for obvious reasons. There's just too many hills. And however, it has been shaped by the indigenous mind. So the people who have lived here for thousands of years, the indigenous population, have transformed this landscape to a degree through their hunting and gathering of fire and so on that they've used to shape the landscape to their advantage. However, they didn't really fundamentally change the ecology. But then along came the colonial settlers, the Europeans, and they totally transformed the landscape into this kind of grid pattern. And the grid pattern is all about kind of making the earth here into a kind of a factory that produces food that can be sent back to the East and to Europe to feed the workers for the Industrial Revolution. So the kind of idea I'm getting across here is our way we think, the kind of value systems that we have, our ideas about the world and how it should be organized and about society, actually physically change the landscape. So this is a great example. So there's, you know, a downside to this, perhaps, you know, the ecology of the Canadian and American plains is radically altered by people. But the opposite of this is that, you know, if our thoughts change the world, if we change our thoughts, then we can change the world as well. So here's an example of a modern landscape that reflects our digital age. So if you look at a circuit board from computers and so on in a city, they're looking pretty similar, kind of a fascinating idea. So in this Anthropocene era where people are dominant in the world, how we focus our attention then must be very, very important. And it kind of determines what our social ecological space looks like. And unfortunately, a lot of our attention is captured by these kind of spectacular events and spectacular images and media that capture our attention. And so instead of putting it into things which are really valuable and important, they go into these things. I'm not trying to say that we should never have these things, but they kind of are very dominant in our culture. And when our attention is preoccupied by self-interest, the acquisition of things and of power, then our social sphere and our ecosphere are increasingly fragmented. So we see scenes like this. This is a Palestinian camp in Syria of utter devastation. These people just basically in really dire straits, and you know, millions and millions of them having to flee from their lands. So it looks a little bit like some of the scenes we see in popular culture of dystopian futures. And so in a sense, I see humanity kind of going into this sort of state of permanent emergency, where there's just every day you hear something new that's terrible on the environmental front and the social front, political front, and so on. So this ecological fragmentation is being seen in this question of climate change. We're in an overheated planet. And this is a map from a couple of years ago of hotspots and fires happening in northern North America, from Alaska throughout Canada. At one point, I think it was 1,500 fires burning, and throughout the whole boreal forest, a huge problem with fires. Happening in the tropics as well, places like Indonesia on fire, Portugal, Spain. So these kind of massive problems that have never been seen before are happening. And it's sometimes really, really dramatic results, huge impacts on wildlife as well as people. And this is an example of in Canada a couple of years ago, the huge fire that caused, they had to evacuate Fort McMurray, a city in Canada's north, which ironically is the center of the Canadian oil sands, which some of the dirtiest oil in the world, producing a lot of pollution, climate pollution, and so on. So now these people in the first world countries like Canada are joining these 65 million social and environmental refugees around the world. And I guess these numbers, 65 million, that's more people than were displaced during the Second World War. So it's starting to be very huge numbers. And so there are many things driving this refugee situation. So for example, look at this image. This is from Munich Re, which is an reinsurance company. So the insurance companies have companies that insure them. And these guys are pretty active these days. Munich Re has been following this climate issue, a lot of denial of climate issues, but in the meantime, companies like Munich Re are following it and really tracking the results of climate change. So in 2015, they went over 1,000 loss events for the first time. Now we're talking about major loss events. And the big circles are loss events that are over $1 billion in damage. And some of these are now going into the tens of billions and $100 billion of damage from these massive hurricanes and so on, affecting the world. So a lot of these things, catastrophes are mounting and they're causing a lot of displacement throughout the world. And unfortunately, the poor are disproportionately impacted. Yet no one is spared. This is Calgary, the oil capital of Canada, underwater a couple of years ago again, of flooding. Another huge problem all around the world. Fires and floods. That seems to be the thing that's coming. And now there's about 3 of these major loss events occurring a day. We talk about the idea of 100-year events like a flood or something that will occur every 100 years, and now starting to happen much, much more frequently. So it's a huge issue. So I think that one way to look at this is that these catastrophes and so on relate to the fact that we moved from an empty world, so a world like this where the country lane, things are fairly quiet, to a world like this. So a full world, so a world that's full of people and our stuff, relatively speaking, compared to what it was in the past. So there's all these implications of this kind of level of activity. So we've moved from this empty world to a full world, and you can see in this graph how things have really taken off lately. So it took 10,000 generations to hit 1 billion human beings around 1800. These are, of course, estimates. But then it only took 6 generations to hit 2 billion. Amazing kind of spike in growth. Then 2 generations for the next set of billions, and 1 generation after that. So 1 generation of people, we're adding 1 billion people to the world. So when I was born in 1952, there were about 2.5 billion, and today there's about 7.5 billion. So this massive spike of growth you can see on the right side of that chart. Excuse me. And along with that, we see this, what they're calling the Great Acceleration that happened around 1950, where everything that we do, world population, the size of our economy, investments, fertilizer consumption, energy use, and everything just took off. And so you can see in each of those graphs how around 1950, growth just skyrocketed. And along with that was a massive amount of pollution, methane pollution, carbon dioxide, all of these things have taken off at the same time. So there's this huge rise of population, and along with that there's a population of things, all the things that we consume and so on. So many consumer goods out there. A big one is the population of our livestock. So there's over 7 billion people, but there's over 25 billion livestock if you include cattle and pigs and poultry and so on. So a huge number of our animals, which we talked about before. And our buildings, 1.7 billion, all having to be heated and lighted and cooled and so on. And all of this takes this huge amount of fossil fuel energy. Right now, 35 billion barrels a year, and these are the oil sands, aerial view of the oil sands, which I mentioned before. So kind of it looks like something like Mordor from Lord of the Rings, and huge implications of burning all these fossil fuels to support all these people and the things that we produce. So now we're getting into this idea of this huge economic growth at some point is no longer economic growth. It becomes uneconomic growth. So there's an increase of illth faster than wealth. So illth is kind of an old term that's come back, and it's kind of like bad wealth. So for example, pollution would be an example of illth. So these disasters are another example, and you can see the economic damage on that red line just increasing and increasing and increasing. So rather than growth causing economic good, which I'm not saying it doesn't ever do that anymore, it still does that, but it also creates a lot of negative growth, negative problems. And in this graph, you'll also see, this is significant, I think, is that the geophysical disasters, things like earthquakes, are not really rising. They're the kind of tan band at the bottom of the graph, and the climate-related disasters are the things that have really taken off. So we're at about 7.5 billion people, but we're overshooting Earth's capacity, its biocapacity. That's its ability to support us, provide all the things that we need, and absorb all the emissions, all the pollution that we put out there, like carbon pollution. So we're already exceeding Earth's biocapacity by about 60% or more, which means we need the equivalent of 1.6 Earths to support our present levels of consumption and emissions. And of course, we don't have 1.6 Earths. So what we're doing is we're actually drawing down on our natural capital. We should be living on, in a sense, the interest of all the natural capital that we have, but we're now starting to draw down on that capital. So it's problematic. But the thing is, this whole human project has only just begun. So we have, in the red line, it shows the rise of population going from around 2.5 billion, as I said, around the time I was born in the 50s, heading up to around 11 billion, according to projections, around 2100. And when I was first writing this book, 11, I was going to call it 10, because that was the projections at the time for world population at the end of the century. Then I found out that 2 other people had already written a book called 10, which was going to be a bit of a problem for me. But then I went back and I looked at the new projections, and they were talking about 10.9 billion people by the end of the century, so it had gone up quite a bit. And I thought, well, that's close enough to 11. But now the new projections are talking about 11.3 billion, 11.2 to 3 billion. So it keeps going up, very problematic. And as it goes up, of course, the gross world product, sort of all the stuff that we produce, our whole economy is going up along with it. So it's going from around $4 trillion up into the $250 trillion is the kind of projection. So a massive increase of the economy with all the implications for the environment. And with that, our ecological footprint, the blue line, going from reasonable levels in the 50s and 60s up to about the equivalent of needing 5 Earths, or 5 Earth equivalent by the end of this century. So as you can see, that's not really feasible. I mean, we can't use 5 Earths because we don't have them. So something's going to have to change very dramatically. What we really need to do is we have to somehow go back to an ecological footprint, so that the impact of everything that we do has to go back to 1975 levels, when there were about 4 billion people. So we're going to increase the population dramatically. We're going to have to provide for all these people. We're going to have to raise up the poor and reduce our ecological footprint. So huge implications to all of this. Now, this is kind of maps out some of the interconnected risks that we're facing as we move forward into this vastly increased population and economy. So a massive number of risks that are in the in the financial area, in the political area, weather, conflict, and so on. So these are being mapped out, and people are thinking about how are we going to deal with all these, and what are the interrelations between them all. So we've got to think through the whole problem. And many people think, when we look at that kind of information, that we are doomed. And this is a very strong current in thought today, that there is no future. So when we see popular culture, we're seeing more and more of this dystopian reality in films and books and so on. And the idea of the zombies and the vampires and so on, there's a real sense of this kind of Walking Dead, and we're in major trouble. And in fact, scientists like Martin Rees, who is probably Britain's best known top scientist, of the Astronomer Royal of Britain, has written this book, Our Final Century. And so he actually gives humanity a 50-50 chance of survival. And Stephen Hawking says, no, we don't have any chance of survival unless we go to other planets and establish new colonies. So very interesting, I think, problems we're facing. Now, there's the question of should we be very pessimistic about the future or optimistic? And I found this notion quite interesting, the difference between optimism and hope. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the deepest difference between linear and covenantal time is that whereas the first gives rise to optimism, the latter leads to hope. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue, hope an active one. It takes no courage, only a certain naivety to be an optimist. It takes courage to sustain hope. So I think if we just look at time flowing, the history flowing, and where it's headed, we don't really have a lot of grounds for optimism. However, if you think in terms of covenantal time, if we bring in the concept of faith and God's plan for the world, we think about things in a different way. So without being naive as believers, I think we can have hope. And I like this concept, which actually comes from the Old Testament of the Bible, the idea of I'm a prisoner of hope. Cornel West and others have taken up this idea. Even though you have grounds for pessimism, you're still a hopeful person. Now, one of the reasons I think we can be hopeful is because of this concept, which is a concept from ecology called panarchy theory. And so this shows how every complex system, every complex, ecological system goes through a number of stages. And, people who are Baha'is will see something reflected in the writings about this kind of rise and fall of civilizations and the reorganization. So this shows, for example, in a forest, how the forest grows up and builds up a lot of natural capital, which is a lot of wood on the forest floor and so on, which creates conditions conducive to fires. The fire comes, burns it out, and it kind of creates maybe a new system with different species of plants and so on, or there's a renewal of the system. And so according to this theory, this happens in all complex systems, in complex organisms, in systems like ecosystems, but also the author talks about this happening in human systems because really human systems are social ecological systems. And this author, Buzz Halling, who came up with this idea of panarchy theory, talks about how the world is headed for this major pulse of transformation. This is coming. And he says an interesting thing about it, which is that we should respond to this with diverse adventures in living. So we shouldn't be too prescriptive. We shouldn't say, well, this is the way the world, this is what we should do exactly. We should be doing this and that, because if we do that, we're kind of looking forward in a rearview mirror. We're basing it on the things we know from the past. What we really should be doing is trying out different things and seeing what works. So he's really talking about, action, reflection. And So here's an example of somebody who's trying something different. This is a high rise in Milan where people are really trying to create a high rise that's a forest right in the middle of the city. And there's this interesting movement of people from being consumers only to prosumers. So people are starting to really do things like produce a lot more of their own food, producing their own power, getting around on their own steam and on walking bicycles and so on. And it's sort of an exciting movement that's happening all over the world. Like, for example, in my city, I was promoting, 20, 30 years ago, the idea of urban agriculture, and nobody seemed interested. Suddenly there's like community gardens all over the city, and schools are growing gardens, kids are growing gardens, people are growing things, growing fruit trees and so on. So there's this big change. And we're starting to see really exciting adventures in sustainable urban designs, whole neighborhoods that are becoming carbon neutral and so on. 800 million people, they say, involved in urban gardening, farming. And so a lot of potential there to grow food in cities and so on, become more food resilient. Countries like Germany changing their energy system. I just was reading this morning an article about how Germany is producing so much renewable power that they're having a problem because they can't use enough of it. So they're going to start to pay people to use power, if you can imagine that. So, there's a sense, well, you can never produce enough power using renewable sources, but apparently that isn't the case. So one of the things I've, in my book 11, I talk about all these wonderful things that are happening around the world, these adventures in living. And it seems like everything that we need to do to make an 11 billion world work is being done somewhere already successfully. So that's encouraging. But the discouraging part is that they're not really being adopted universally. They're more like prototypes here and there, but not really being adopted by the mainstream of society. So this brings us to the question of how do we change? And I think more and more people are realizing that the political approach to the different problems that we're facing today is really inadequate. And more that seems possible. And I think that's reflected by perhaps how few people really engage in the political process, maybe other than complaining. But they don't get involved in elections. Turnouts to elections are very, very low and so on. So what we're really talking about, and I think I've sort of built the case for this, we really need transformation on an unprecedented scale. So we need a new culture, we need a new agriculture, and we need really, ultimately, a new human race. We need to transform completely if we're going to live together in a peaceful way, 11 billion of us on this one small planet. And I think behind all this is the need for a real ethical revolution. So this is just a diagram that seems to show kind of what people value. And it seems right now most of our value is on things which are rather unnecessary and even destructive. So what we value a lot is consumption, things like fashions and so on. Huge resources go into our military, into conflict, preparing for conflicts, and a great deal of focus on addictions of various sorts, which really have a huge detrimental impact on society. So this is just a chart I put together of what I call wasted wealth. So some of the things that we focus our attention on here are really destructive, and a lot of our wealth goes into these things. So once again, like for example, some of the vices like gambling, prostitution, pornography, $600 billion a year spent on those things. And that's just the smallest one. We get to consumer goods. For the consumer goods bought by the top 20% of the world's population in terms of income, $20 trillion. So now this is, to me, is really depressing to look at that in one way, but on the other hand, what it means is there's a huge amount of wealth that we have here that's just kind of wasted on things or is more focused on the destructive, which could be turned around and release all this wealth for positive change. So what if we could change our value system? What if we could change our inner world? And what impact would that have on our outer world? So what if our our value system changed so that things like our inner life, our relationships, spiritual values, concepts like service became the most important values, or the restoration of the ecosphere, or just meeting basic human needs for everyone. And these other things kind of fell away to a certain degree. Perhaps they'll always be there to some degree, but why should they take up so much of our attention? So this would release a huge amount of wealth for reconstructing civilization and restoring the ecosphere. So right values really help us focus human attention on unified action. And there's this idea that ideas transform landscapes. So I'm going to show a video now of this Los Plateau in China, where people have come together, brought their ideas together, their work together, their attention, and see what the results are.
China's Los Plateau is a region that stretches for 640,000 square kilometers across north-central China. Unspoilt valleys in neighboring Sichuan show us how it might once have looked. It's the sort of natural abundance that is necessary to support an emerging civilization. How could a landscape with such potential have been reduced to this? When Chinese scientists and civil engineers began to survey the area, they realized that several thousand years of agricultural exploitation had denuded the hills and valleys of vegetation. The relentless grazing of domestic animals on the slopes meant that there was no chance for young trees and shrubs to grow. The rainfall no longer seeped into the earth, but simply washed down the hillsides, taking the soil with it. Over millennia, this progressively destroyed the region's fertility. When this happens over an area as extensive as the plateau, millions of tons of silt are swept down into the Yellow River. When I first filmed Mr. Ta Fuyuan and his colleagues back in 1995, I had no idea this initiative could achieve such dramatic results. The effort that people put into converting their slopes into terraces has resulted in a marked increase in agricultural productivity. The higher yields are directly related to the return of natural vegetation in the surrounding ecological land.
This filmmaker had gone in and a number of years ago and shot these scenes, and he goes back 15 years later and shows it again. So we see the transformation of that landscape and the ecological restoration that happened. Now, the Los Plateau is about the size of France, and it's considered the cradle of Chinese civilization. And they've restored an area that's about as large as Belgium. So when people come together and sort of focus their attention on these things, the potential is really quite fantastic. So our collective focused human attention is really important, and our unity of thought can actually change the world in very dramatic ways, as we see in this example in China. So what we need to do is really look at, we talked before about the great acceleration, and we need to, a great deceleration in terms of our economic growth. We need to learn to avoid certain things that we've done and shift certain things. So avoid industries and so on that create a lot of pollution, and shift, for example, our energy system from the fossil fuel system to renewables. And those kind of things have to be done and really adopted on a massive scale. In agriculture, this is critically important, the area of our food system, because this is something that's utterly important for every human being. And we have to increase our agricultural outputs so that everyone can be fed, all these new people, and the hungry can be fed that already exist. But what we're finding is, most of the new population in the world that's coming will be in these low-income countries, where most of the farms are very small. There's about 2.5 billion small farmers and their families. And so this is really the type of, in order to feed people, I think rather than increasing production in countries like Canada, the US, or Europe, there needs to be systems in place that really help these small farmers produce for their local populations, which is where the growth in population will be. So things like agroecology have been found to be very productive, and it follows the ecological model. And carbon farming is another potential. So where you're trying to grow crops that will absorb a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and help to deal with the whole issue of climate change. And there's a huge amount of potential in agriculture to do this. So we need to focus our attention on restoring the ecosphere. And interestingly, about 3.5 billion hectares of land are degraded in the world, so a huge amount. That would be larger than the size of the African continent. So if we can support the rural poor to restore land, it sort of has multiple benefits. One is helping to transfer some of the wealth to these people so that they can restore their landscapes. We're talking about maybe as little as $50 a year for some of these small farmers could really help them on the road to change if we focus some green payments on their work. Could help to eliminate poverty and hunger at that scale, increase their biocapacity, ameliorate climate change, and avoid this problem of a migration of people off the land. In a sense, it would be equivalent to creating a new continent. So now into this idea of transformational processes, how can we, help this to happen? I like this quote from Buckminster Fuller: "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Interesting. So what are steps to transformation? Well, I think probably the first one is just the capacity to actually know what's going on. So we have a world, I think, in many ways is in denial. We don't accept the situation that we're in, the ecological reality that we're living in, and the impact of what we're doing. So we need to really read our reality. We need to develop unity of thought and develop a better balance of material goals and spiritual, the spiritual aspirations of people. So, for example, we can develop our inner life, our relationships, and have them more the center of our value system than just the material. The capacity for service is very important, and having an action orientation. So, for example, world leaders are meeting and they have climate summits and so on, and plans are put in place, but often no action takes place. So we have to really move to an action orientation. And the process that we develop has to be really systematic, but it also has to be planet-wide. It has to happen everywhere. And it has to involve individuals, communities, and institutions. So there are a number of examples I talk about in my book where we're really trying to build this new kind of cultural, ecological ethos, the Millennium Villages projects in Africa, for example. I talk about the Harlem Children's Zone, which is an example in a wealthy country. Excuse me. So these are ways people are trying to do these diverse adventures of living that I talked about and try and make a change. However, one of the problems with this is some of these modes are really looking at increasing people's material well-being. So if these processes succeed and bring people additional material wealth, which I'm not opposing, but if they just become part of this middle class and become consumers, we just have a bigger problem than we had before. It's just a different problem. So what we need is really different approach entirely, and that's where I think this idea of the Ruhi Institute, this change process, comes into place. So it's as of course many of you are involved in it, I know, and it's a global movement of cultural transformation through education. It's grassroots, it's worldwide, and it's about really changing our culture. It addresses the spiritual as well as the material, which I think is really critical. If we just focus on improving people's life materially without looking at the spiritual, we're getting deeper and deeper into this ecological problem. It operates at the local level, but I think really importantly, there are these global feedback loops. So people all over the world share information, they share it regionally, they share it internationally, and then the learning can be reflected back on people to help accelerate the process. And I think another thing that's really important about it is it's not just the idea of development for the poor. I think it's development for all human beings. And the cause of most of the problems in the world, if we look at the ecosystems at least, are the middle income and rich people. So they really have to change their lifestyles. And I think this Reallocating Institute really addresses everyone. It also addresses all age groups, which is really important too, because we found that children and youth are important change agents. So this is just a graphic I put together of this whole process. And it's kind of a complex transformative process, but I think has been found to be very effective in a number of places. So I want to just show you a clip out of Frontiers of Learning. It's just about 5 minutes, and that will end up my presentation. And it shows, I think if you kind of think of what I've been saying throughout, and look how this community is going through this transformative process and applying some of the learning that how they're actually starting to change their culture. And by changing the culture, they're starting to have some impacts on the natural environment as well. So we'll just watch that now.
भारत के उत्तर पूर्व दिशा में बिहार स्थित है। यहाँ पे गौतम बुद्ध आए और अपना ज्ञान अर्जन किया। बिहार शरीफ क्लस्टर में 6000 ऐसे लोग होंगे जो समुदाय निर्माण में अपना योगदान दे रहे हैं। पिछले कुछ सालों में लगभग 1000 से ज़्यादा किशोर हैं जो किशोर कार्यक्रम से गुजर चुके हैं।
हमारे किशोर समूह का नाम सत्यवादिता है। आज हम सब पर्यावरण के शुद्धता के लिए वृक्षारोपण करने जा रहे हैं।
लगभग 900 के आसपास में ऐसे बच्चे हैं जो बच्चों के कार्यक्रम से गुजर चुके हैं और लगभग 500 ऐसे वयस्क हैं जो संस्थान प्रक्रिया से गुजर चुके हैं। 60 प्रार्थनाएं सभा को संचालित किया जा रहा है। सभी आते हैं और उत्साह के साथ भाग लेते हैं और उनसे प्रेरणा पाते हैं। इन सब गतिविधियों की वजह से व्यक्ति की समुदाय और संस्थाओं में गहरा बदलाव आ रहे हैं। संस्कृति के स्तर पे बहुत सारी बदलाव आ रहे हैं, जिसकी वजह से सदियों से चली आ रही पूर्वाग्रहों से लोग धीरे धीरे मुक्त हो रहे हैं। हमारे भारत देश में जाति प्रथा की जो भेदभाव है बहुत गहन रूप से जकड़ रखा है। यह एक सामाजिक बनावटी व्यवस्था है। उच्च जाति और निम्न जाति के लोग आपस में न घुल मिल पाते हैं, न बैठ पाते हैं, न बातें कर पाते हैं, न साथ में खाना खा पाते हैं।
जिस रूही बन पढ़ने से मेरा अच्छा बहुत दिमाग खुला। उससे सीख मिलता है कि जाति प्रथा नहीं हो सकता है। समाजों अभी देखते हैं तो बहुत खुशी आनंद लगता है। पहले जैसा दुख किसी को भोगना नहीं पड़ता है।
पहले लोग बोलते थे कि मैंने अलग अलग जात घर में नहीं आना चाहिए, बाहर आना चाहिए, दूर भाव करना चाहिए। जब स्टडी सर्कल के साथ हम लोग जुटे तो हम लोग के भेदभाव के नाम मिट जाने के लगा और स्वागत करने के लिए हम लोग आमंत्रित रहते हैं।
अपने बच्चे को प्रवेश करते हुए हम निर्णय लिया कि हमने नहीं बताएं कि किस जाति का है, ताकि उसको मन में विचार नहीं आएगा कि ऊंचा है या नीचा, और ना ही सामने वाले को ऊंची या नीची नज़र से देख पाए। सभी को समान नज़र से देख पाए।
हमारे संस्कृति में वयस्क और युवाओं के बीच काफ़ी दूरियां थी।
पहले देखिए, जो बुजुर्ग लोग अक्सर हमने कुछ बोल देते थे तो युवाओं लोग को मान लेना पड़ता था, लेकिन संस्थान प्रक्रिया आने से काफ़ी बदलाव हुआ। अब हम लोग के अवसर मिल रहा है कि एक साथ बैठ करके युवा और बुजुर्ग लोग दोनों मिलकर परामर्श करते हैं और फिर परामर्श करके ही निर्णय लेते हैं।
कि महिलाओं को कभी भी निर्णय लेने का अधिकार नहीं दिया जाता है, उनकी क्षमताओं को हमेशा कम करके आंका जाता है। साथ ही लड़कियों को बहुत ही कम उम्र में उनकी शादियां कर दिया जाता है। वहाँ पे लड़कियों की कोई इच्छा नहीं चलता है, वहाँ पे कोई निर्णय लड़कियों से नहीं लिया जाता है, कोई परामर्श उनके साथ नहीं किया जाता है।
हमारे पापा जी जो थे कम ही एज में शादी कर दिए थे, तो इस तरह से हमें पहले कुछ नहीं महसूस होता था कि शादी क्या है। और जब फिर हम यहाँ आए तो देखें कि घर से बाहर नहीं निकलना है, हमको मतलब घर के अंदर ही रहना पड़ता था। तो कोई आए थे तो बोले कि इस तरह का बुक है, आप करना चाहते हैं। मेरी सास किसी तरह से तैयार हुई, अपना हस्बैंड से भी पूछे, तो इस तरह से मैं बुक की पूरे। जब से हम इस संस्थान में जुड़ी हूँ, हम देखते हैं कि बहुत बदलाव आ रहा है, बंधन भी टूट गया है।
यहाँ पर संस्कृति में कि लड़कियों को घर से निकलने के लिए नहीं दिया जाता है। हम सिर्फ स्कूल से घर, घर से स्कूल जाते थे। लेकिन जैसे कि हम संस्थान प्रक्रिया में आए, हमें बाहर जाने का मौका मिला। अब हम जूनियर कोऑर्डिनेटर के रूप में सेवा दे रहे हैं। हम अपने गांव में भी एक ग्रुप विजिट करते हैं और अलग अलग गांव में भी हम जाते हैं, वहाँ पर भी ग्रुप विजिट करते हैं और हम एनिमेटर के साथ बात करते हैं ग्रुप के बारे में भी, और एक दूसरे के साथ मित्रता बन गया है। यहाँ पर संस्कृति में गार्जियन तय करते हैं कि कौन किससे हम बेटी का शादी हो, और लड़की को मर्जी नहीं लिया जाता है। गांव में हम देखते हैं कि लड़कियों को शादी 12-13 साल में हो जाता है।
हमको शादी हुआ था तो हम 12 साल के थे। हम पति के कभी देखे थे नहीं। हम अपना बेटी के कम उम्र में नहीं करने के लिए सोचते थे। हमको रिवा बेटी अपना पसंद करने के बाद माता पिता से राय ले ली, उसको बाद शादी की है।
हमारे यहाँ एक नई सभ्यता, एक नई संस्कृति उत्पन्न हुआ है, जो है लोग शिक्षा के प्रति जागरूक हुए हैं। ऊंच नीच का जो है भेद कम हुआ है। फिर जो है महिलाओं को सम्मान पहले से ज़्यादा मिलता है। अब लड़कियों का जो है कम उम्र में शादी होना कम हो गया है। तो इस तरह से जो है नई संस्कृति का जो है चलन हुआ है।
I think that's an opportunity to kind of get a glimpse of what perhaps some of this cultural change can achieve. Now you might say, now how does this sort of change address the ecological issues? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is this issue of the status of women. So wherever in the world the status of women has increased, the birth rate has gone down. So obviously we have to at some point achieve zero population growth. And if we don't do that, we're really in trouble. So the raising of the status of women has a direct impact on the environment. I saw a study that said if there's anything you can do to reduce environmental impacts, it's have one less child. So there's an example. The other one I think is quite interesting is this idea of changing the caste system, or the idea of caste prejudice. I remember hearing that Prime Minister Modi of India asked the civil service to go out and clean up because there's a huge problem in India of just trash and pollution all over the place. And people weren't willing to do it because only lower castes could clean things up. So even the concept of changing the caste system would be very, very significant in terms of transformation of culture and the impacts on the environment. So those are just a couple of examples. Now, probably most of us are in Canada or the United States, and the set of problems we're dealing with may be somewhat different. But whatever it is, we have to look at it and make the change. So I guess the idea is just to elevate conversations, to really promote ethical education and service orientation. And all of these things are kind of the initial steps towards social change that we're working on. So just to finish up here, the idea is to start it off where that human unity is a prerequisite for reintegrating the ecosphere, and that changing our inner world and our relationships changes the outer world, and that this sort of process of healing the planet will really actually help us to unite too. So there's a two-way street here. So those are the ideas I'd like to share. I think I'm within an hour exactly. And just to say that there's going to be a course on this book and many other things related to it started by the Wilmot Institute this week. So if you're interested in this, please check that out as well. Now, if you do want to get my book, you can find it on online stores and so on.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was fantastic. And really intriguing too, because it gives us a good sense of the challenges humanity now faces. I had not really realized that we were heading towards needing 5 Earths. And if, for that matter, even that we're 1.6 Earths now, that's really quite a frightening statistic. And it does make you wonder how we're going to back ourselves out of this crisis. We do have a few questions, and let me pop them up here. Shahla asks this very interesting question. When we say violence is decreasing, is it relative to the size of the population, and how is violence defined?
Yeah, I was talking about Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature. So he kind of looks at statistics, and he looks at, from archaeology, they can find out how many people died from injuries like head injuries and so on in earlier states of civilization. And then there was efforts to start keeping statistics on deaths and the cause of death in a number of different countries, starting in the, I think maybe 18th, 19th century and so on. And as a percentage of population, the number of deaths by violence is going down. Number of violence, even violence against women and so on, is decreased. Although obviously it seems very opposite, but I think when the light gets brighter, the shadows get deeper. When we see things may improve, but then any example of a problem becomes much more significant to us. So when we have, for example, the idea of human rights, now we recognize that people in the past, our ancestors may have seen as worthless. Now we see them as having worth. Then if there's an injury to them, we see that as a really negative thing. And so it gives us the impression that violence is increasing, but actually the science seems to indicate that it is not.
Yeah, it seems to me, I had read once that anthropologists have studied the San people, of the so-called the Bushmen of Botswana, and they typically live in family or clan groups, but when they get together once a year as a whole tribe of 400 or 500 people, they just don't know how to live together as 400 or 500 people because they never do it. And so there's a lot higher chance of murders and other kinds of violence when the whole tribe gets together. They don't have laws, they don't have police, they don't have judges, and they don't have the mechanisms that we have in societies. That's an example that I've heard.
Yeah, I think in Europe, there was war pretty much continuously for several hundred years. until into the 19th century. And even in, of course, the 20th century, these massive wars started in Europe. And but now Europe is basically, relatively speaking, a very peaceful place.
Sure. There's another question here. Perjea says she doesn't have words to express my appreciation for this webinar. Thank you so much. Elahe echoes her wonderful talk. May we use the YouTube of this presentation at our local Baha'i centers? And the answer to that, of course, is once we've got it on YouTube, it's on YouTube. Anyone can use it. And this is one of the reasons the Wilmette Institute provides these web talks. We want to encourage everybody to replay them, use them in public settings, private settings, whatever. And this particular one, I think, is a good example of why we want to do that. People need to know about the situation and the possibilities for the future. We have another question here also. So I made it go away here accidentally. It sounds as though no population growth, sounds as though you are promoting no population growth, but what exactly do you mean, since it is counter to the Baha'i position, all religions and human nature in general? I'm not sure how it's counter, but at any rate, what do you think about no population growth?
Well, I think zero population growth doesn't mean that there's no more babies. It means that I think really what we need to get to is basically around 2 children per fertile woman. And so you'd still be having children and families, but it's when you go above that that you start to have this continuous increase. And so actually this is happening pretty well everywhere in the world. The population rate is decreased. The population growth rate is decreasing down towards zero population growth. But there are a few places which are exceptions. For example, I was shocked by Nigeria, which according to the projections would become the 3rd most populous country in the world by the end of the century, with 900 million people, and it's about 1/10 the size of China. So there's a number of countries, like about 10 countries, that are not decreasing their population growth rate, or at least not very much. And so they're really critically important, I think, for this kind of work to be extended there.
When you mention 5 Earths or 4 Earths of demand in the future, how do you think we're going to provide the food? Presumably we can continue to increase the yield per acre or hectare, and that means that we don't necessarily have to continuously increase the number of hectares that we're farming. But obviously, and we can reduce the amount of food that goes to feeding the animals too, obviously. But what's the sort of combination that seems likely to work?
Well, I think there really aren't a lot more acres or hectares of arable land that we can develop. So the growth would have to be in the production per hectare. The other thing is there's this issue of food waste, and somewhere between 30 and 40% of all food is wasted. So just increasing our efficiencies with how we use the food that we produce is really important. A much more efficient use of irrigation water, things like that are really critical. But I think the key thing is these 2.5 billion people involved in small farms, which are farms of maybe a ½ hectare to 2 hectares in size. And there's a lot of potential there with agroecology, permaculture, and so on, to really increase production on those farms without needing to bring in external resources. So without needing to bring in expensive fertilizers and pesticides and so on. So I think a lot of potential there on that level, and I think that's where a lot of attention should be focused. I think people, I talk about this quite a bit in my book, have figured out really how to, systems to transfer funds, and it doesn't have to be large amounts of funds, to those small farmers in green payments to help them kind of transition into you know, because we're talking about a lot of people here who have an annual income of, you know, maybe $300, $400, $500 a year. So a $50 payment to a small farmer could give them enough of a boost to develop these transformative agricultural practices on their small farm. And it would be, you know, actually a fairly minimal amount if we look at expenditures like the military and so on. So I think a lot of hope in that.
But would it be enough to keep them from moving to the big city where they can earn $1,000, $2,000 a year doing something there? I mean, it seems to me that's part of the problem too, is that there's an income disparity between the rural and urban areas that somehow has to be adjusted, so that, I mean, China is going to have absolutely enormous numbers of huge cities because of the population moving to the cities.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, we really have to look at that and the question of how do we revitalize the village as well as the city. And, you know, the village is where, you know, close to 50% of the world's population still live there. Can we create a kind of village that's a really wonderful place to live? You know, I think when people transfer themselves into the cities, especially at the beginning of their transition, life can be really, really hard, and many people regret doing that. So why are they leaving these rural communities? Can something like the Institute process really help to transform those communities to make them attractive places to live, to the point where we might see a urban to rural migration?
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are key issues. I think maybe, you know, even things like technology and so on might make, for rural youth, might add to the, you know, the ability to get an education at the local level, to connect with other people around the world, that kind of thing, so that people don't feel quite as isolated. But if you look at that Bihar example, one of the things you see is people in the community starting to consult together, like youth and elders more, instead of just having to do what the elders tell you to do. So these kind of things, I think, make the community more attractive and help maybe keep youth in the community.
I was in Bolivia some years back, and we visited a little village called Puka Puka, which was a sort of string of houses along the top of a canyon that was mostly Baha'is. And I was quite struck that they could go to Sucre, which was 120 kilometers away. If they could get a ride like on the back of someone's truck, they'd go shopping there. And when they would go shopping, they'd go to the Raul Pavon Baha'i Institute. They'd use it as their base of operations. They'd bring their stuff back there to store it. And then they would get the ride back from the Raul Pavon Institute back to their village, and their youth would go to the Raul Pavon Institute also to live in Sucre, take some classes. There was a little dorm. There was they would cook their own food there. So it was a very interesting cooperative between the big city and a small village that was it was a good 2-hour drive away. And those are the kinds of things that really help when you can have these networking. You don't have to just go live in the city, but you can go visit it, and your kids can go visit for a while and get some education and come back, and you can find out about opportunities and work with development agencies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think this, you know, the kind of mobility of the world's population is a beautiful thing in some ways, but it's also, there's some negative aspects to it. And there's a lot of brain drains from smaller centers and lower income countries to rich countries and so on, which are quite problematic. And I think, you know, measures that would make these places more vital and more attractive to youth and so on are really important. Probably people have all seen the new film Light to the World. And there's one section in there where a gentleman is from Panama, who's a Guaymi indigenous person. He talks about how literacy really changed his community. And I had the privilege in 1983 of going to the Guaymi reservation in Panama. And I remember even at that time being kind of surprised to see that how much more developed the Baha'i community was there than it was where I came from. At that time, there were like 15,000 Baha'is in this community of about 60,000. they had their own, they ran their own schools, and there were schools open to everybody. They had radio stations. They had social economic development projects going. And so, you know, I think if, and that community was very isolated, like you had to walk into it for a long distance and so on. And, but to see that kind of potential developing in there is, I think, is really exciting, and maybe it answers some of the question we're talking about rural development versus urban.
Yeah, it's essential because in many places around the world, I mean, when I was in Bolivia, again, I was only there for a week, I was amazed by how much gullying there was from the overuse of the land. And if you can't figure out a way to support those rural villages, ultimately you're going to have some mega cities and a lot of national parks and a lot of abandoned land. And was struck me as really a sad situation that would be hard to avoid. But clearly the Baha'is had their own approach because they were getting development dollars even out in the rural areas, and they were taking UNESCO courses together on reading and writing and counting and arithmetic. I was really quite impressed.
Yeah.
Janet has, and that was 20 years ago, Janet has this interesting question. She says, I think that the earth is already overpopulated. I too grew up in the 50s, and negotiating traffic, observing nature, housing options were much more pleasant. Is there anything in the Baha'i writings that speaks to the need for moderation in human population? Our present population already seems excessive. Resigning oneself to 11 billion sounds terrible, sounds horrible.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just, I think conveying what demographers are saying is where population is going. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. And as far as the Baha'i writings go, I mean, moderation in all things, I think, is the key there. And I think there's no way we can really, often I get this response that people say, well, we should be reducing our population. Well, who are we going to reduce?
Yeah.
Like, are you going to, who's going to volunteer to be the one to reduce or not to have any children and so on? So I think the population is going to go up. There's no doubt about it. But we ultimately have to hit the zero population growth. And, if you look at the projections for 11 billion, we're talking about 11 billion around there being a peak population because the population growth rate is going down. So probably we're going to get there. Now, mind you, the number of births per woman, it just has to go down a little bit, and we may there could be another scenario where the population growth is quite a bit lower, which would probably make life a lot easier. But there's also a projection where it could be quite a bit higher.
Yeah.
So if we were continuing with the population growth that we had in the first 10 years of this century, if that continued at that level, we'd hit 27 billion by the end of this century. So the 11 billion is already because population growth is declining. I think it's a reality. We're just heading towards this, and we have to deal with it. But we do need to achieve zero population growth ultimately.
Yeah. Do you think that renewable energy is sufficient to provide 11 billion people with electricity, with refrigerators, with basic necessities, power necessities, whatever that is?
Yeah, I do. And there's a number of, people have developed scenarios where this can happen. We're starting to see, I mentioned the example of the article I saw just today in the news of Germany having to pay people to use power because they're producing so much renewable power. So I think there's a few countries that have really gone down this road. There's a number of countries now who have decided by, let's say, 2030 or between 2030 and 2050 to eliminate fossil fuel use. China's decided to eliminate fossil fuel-used vehicles over the next several decades. So there's a lot of potential, and almost all the growth in energy supply is renewable energy these days. So there's very little, in terms of electricity, there's very little new energy from other sources being added. Most of it is renewables. So it's happening, but it's going to take, you don't change an energy system overnight. It's going to take several decades to do it.
Judith has this interesting comment. She says, the Earth is fighting back and is certainly not choosy about who is eliminated.
Well, you know, I think people, excuse me, I think people think that, you know, there could be a terrible catastrophe that would reduce the Earth's population. But let's say there was a catastrophe, a horrible catastrophe that took out 100 million people, kind of unimaginable. Well, that, you know, it sounds kind of crass, but that wouldn't even really have that much impact on this total population we're talking about in you know, rising to about 9 billion by the middle of this century and up to 11. So even catastrophic destruction of people wouldn't change the scenario that much, and God forbid that would ever happen. But, you know, I think if people don't change, if our culture doesn't change, then we will see some level of catastrophe that would reduce our population. But we're all kind of working for this profound cultural change that will help us to avoid that. And Baha'u'llah said that, you know, we can reduce the severity of the impact of the change that's coming through our actions. We can't eliminate it, but we can reduce it.
Betty asks this interesting question. She says, in light to the world, most of the examples were from rural areas, and many of your examples also were rural. Can you talk about examples among Baha'is or any populations in urban areas who are dealing with, in a significant way, with environmental and other issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think probably even that example of the community in India that we looked at the video. Now in India, maybe that's considered to be a town or village, but where I'm from, that would probably be the biggest city in the country. You know, it's so there's a lot of activity going on in urban areas. When we did the course through the Wilmot Institute on agriculture, it was really interesting to see how many of the Baha'is and other people involved in the course were engaged in urban farming and had projects going on where they were working with other players in the community, with schools and so on, to develop urban agriculture and local food systems, build food sovereignty and so on. So I was quite impressed with that, and the number of the number of small farmers in the U.S. and in Canada who are Baha'is, who were really trying to develop effective systems and contribute to their local food economy. So we're seeing that. I think you know, Europe is probably at the forefront in terms of building more sustainable communities in cities. And I just provided one example there in the slideshow, but there are many, and countries like Germany and Denmark and the Scandinavian countries are often leaders in those areas in terms of public transportation, food systems, renewable energy, and so on. But interestingly, China is becoming a real global leader in many of these areas as well. And they have seen the potential markets and so on for renewable energy. And apparently the Chinese government feels one area where it's very vulnerable is the area of citizens' concerns about pollution. So they are starting to take measures to try and adopt that, such as transitioning into electric vehicles. So there are technological fixes that people are trying, but I think the focus that I've put on, and I think we need more of, is in terms of social technologies, how we organize ourselves as communities, and that's really critical, because the way, as we become united, we see the results mirrored in the world around us, in the physical environment.
I think in the developed world, one of the, you might say, disadvantages the Baha'i community has is that governmental structures are very well established and organized. We can't just create a school because they have to be accredited, and those have very high standards, and you can't just meet under a tree because there are a lot of better options. And in other parts of the world, things are not quite that advanced, and therefore the Baha'is are in the position to sort of provide a breakthrough and provide a foundational set of institutions. And seemingly that's one of the differences too.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't see any more questions, but I'll ask one more question so that people have a chance to ask a question. And that's, have we any idea, you know, in what is 1817 or so, there was what they call the year without summer, when a volcanic eruption basically eliminated summer for much of the northern hemisphere. Something like that, it seems to me, in our highly developed agricultural systems around the world would have an enormous potential for wreaking havoc with the world's food supply.
Yes, certainly would.
Yeah.
that kind of disaster, you know, if it happens, well, you know, nobody can predict it, and there could be devastating consequences from that. Somehow, though, doesn't it seem that that people survive? Like when that happened, I don't know what level of population decline there was. I think just people suffered. There probably was a certain amount of death, but there's probably more people suffered through.
Yeah.
And we probably learn an awful lot about how little we can get by on.
Yeah, that's true. Well, when that happened for the United States, I suspect the population density was low enough so people could go out and, you know, shoot more deer and raccoons and such, and fish in the river a little more, and make up part of the deficit that way. But that kind of solution doesn't exist as much nowadays.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions, and we've certainly gone quite a long time, so perhaps, oh, here's another one. Well, Judith is asking about plagues also, and I guess we've got pretty good health systems now for controlling that, but you never know. Christine also has said, in the developed world, people are often comfortable and don't see the need to change as much as in poor countries. The Universal House of Justice asks the Baha'is to turn away from consumerism, but it's often difficult to understand what that means. There's a new 6-week course for the Baha'i junior youth on the story of stuff that helps to raise awareness about that. And that's something that was developed partly with people through the Wilman Institute courses on sustainable development. So that's a very good point that people can use that.
Yeah, I think that this is I think this whole question of, you know, of what is development, and I think we in this part of the world think of, you know, that the poor need development, and I think probably most of the type of problem I'm talking about in this book really are caused by the more wealthy people. Probably the top 20% of the world's population in terms of income are the cause of most of the environmental problems that we're facing, especially something like climate change. So really the need for transformation to occur at the level of the, you know, at the wealthy nations, the wealthy and the middle class is really, really critical. But I think that Christine is right that it really is, you know, we think we're okay because we have, generally speaking, we tend to have what we need. So probably people who are a little more vulnerable are more open to change than we are. And I certainly don't see a huge amount of interest in something like the Institute process where I live, which is a fairly affluent city. Because I don't think people kind of get that we need to change, and maybe we're the ones that need to change the most.
Yeah. Yeah. Janet asks whether the charts that were in the PowerPoints would be available, and are we able to make your PowerPoint available on our website?
Well, it's okay with me, but it's going to be that YouTube. It's going to be on YouTube, so I guess that would be the best way to deal with it.
Yeah.
A lot of the charts are in the book, and yeah.
Good. Well, I want to thank you again. This was really a fantastic web talk, and I think one that we'll be thinking about for really quite a long time. One that will, I hope, help us change our view of the world and a view of our own consumption, and help us think of ways that we can sort of move our whole society forward and consume less.